Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is about how to use AI to heal trauma. So this is basically about using neurolinguistic programming using neurolinguistic programming to heal trauma. So today we have a very special guest with us who is Michelangiolo Mazzeschi. So let's welcome Michelangiolo.
Thank you very much, Miss Ahir. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
Wonderful. Thank you for having me.
So what is it that you're going to be talking about today? Can you give us a brief introduction?
Of course. So today my presentation is regard how to treat trauma. And so instead of just going full with AI, I scheduled the presentation in three parts. The first one, I will introduce what is trauma and how it's healed therapeutically. And the second one, it's what are the available software on treating traumas, what is the current state of the research. And the third part is specifically how would I build a software that can heal traumas given the available information.
So this sounds very interesting. I will just leave the stage to you to get started. So I wish you the best of luck and the stage is yours.
Thank you. So can you see my presentation? Perfect. Okay, let me put it full screen. Is it full screen right now? Second. Okay, should be full screen. Great. So my name is Michelangiolo Mazzeschi. First of all, thank you so much to Global AI Hub for having me today. It's a beautiful community, and I'm sure everybody would like to join them. They offer courses. They also offer a lot of new articles every single day. So first of all, a little bit about my background. So my background is in finance. At the moment, I'm working for a real estate fund and several other startups and funds creating artificial intelligence model, API, usually what is required by the market. And let's say in the last year, I became experienced in creating machine learning and deep learning models. And so first of all, when I've been contacted, I've been asked, okay, so how do what would you like to talk about? And I think the first thing I wanted to talk about was how to, maybe how to simplify artificial intelligence, but you can find that on the internet in very big volume. So I said, why don't I just make something new? And one of my previous experience has been working for a friend, for a psychologist. And I've been creating statistical models for her, personality models based on the Big Five personality test. And but I also learned a lot from researching in literature, specifically also about the trauma literature. And so I thought, okay, that is interesting to explain, but now that I know how to create artificial intelligence, how can I apply that specific knowledge to create an AI model? And so are there already artificial intelligence models that can help the healing of trauma? The answer is no. There are some software, NLP based, but not so advanced. So right now, this presentation will escalate in different levels. Instead of just going technical, I will start from the psychological perspective, and I will end with a computer science one, without using code. I want to use this presentation for everyone. And of course, feel free to ask any question at any point in time, if I'm able to check them. And so let's start the presentation. Each part has a correspondent color, so you will notice which part of the presentation I'm in. So at the beginning, I really had to explain exactly what is a trauma, and that is the entire presentation should take about 30-40 minutes. So of course, they will send me a message if I'm too slow or too quick. But so to start explaining what is a trauma, I know that there are many different ways of explaining traumas. There is a biochemical perspective, neurological perspective, biochemical, and then there is a psychological one, behavioral psychology specifically. And there are other one, even a sociological one. So I will I will focus on the behavioral psychology mostly. So know that what I'm explaining is one of the many possible dimensions that I can use to explain what are traumatic experience. And the best way to start is how do we understand, how do we frame reality? This is a model that shows how people, when growing up, represent reality. It has been developed by Piaget, who's not even a genius, a hyper genius. So this is a social constructivism, especially, specifically. So you start having a framework of interpretation, how you see things from when you're a young person, let's say those 2-year-old. But then when time increases and also your cognitive your exposure to complexity increases. So things become more complex, things becomes, you have to frame the world in a different way. And how do you do that? You expand, say, your way to see the world. But it's not only an expansion. You see, you create a set of hierarchies, one after the other. And then sometimes you are exposed too much to complexity, those red parts, and you have to destroy some of your current framework of your reality. You understand that the way you see the look at the world at the moment is not clear, is not real, it doesn't work. So you destroy that and you build some parts over it and you keep building. And so you start of creating hierarchies. It's like, and this expands to different dimensions of interpretation, from the morality, let's say, to the way you see your goals. Now, and the other thing, I'm so sorry, at the beginning begins with a complex issue, but it's also a phenomenological concept. So the way you see the reality is not only in the present, it's the past that is implicit in the present and the future that is also implicit. So when you live in the past, your when you live in the present, your present makes sense because you have certain experience in your past and you have expectation for the future. It's like when you're a kid and they tell you that Santa Claus does not exist anymore. What do? Your past didn't make a sense. Your previous Christmas did not make sense because of this discovery, and your future doesn't make sense because your next Christmas will not make sense. So in this case, you have to rebuild a missing structure that has been pre-existed in your framework of interpretation of reality. And this missing structure here is represented with the red, let's say, with the red line. And what happens is when you are exposed too much to complexity, well, then you have what is called a trauma. And it's like it's in your past and is a big emotion that is stuck in your past. So there are different levels of traumas, of course, and I'm not going to talk about PTSD because apparently I don't even know much. But it's a very very heavy kind of trauma that requires clinical therapies to solve. So if the trauma is contained, let's say, is between the PTSD and unprocessed thoughts. So we can say fairly everybody has at least 2 or 3 big traumas in their life, and everybody has unprocessed thoughts. So it's something that is common for all human beings and has been common to all human beings since the beginning of history. And so at the moment, what are the methods of healing traumas? I'm sorry if I start from this one. I will slowly make sense in the proceeding with the presentation. So what are the methods of healing trauma? The first one is EMDR, is a stimulation, bipolar stimulation. It's like the REM, when you dream, the REM phase, you have stimulation of left and right. And I'm not an expert on this, but I think you can add information to your trauma and see if you can process it this way, but it requires an expert. The other way instead, it's everybody, let's say, can do it. It's more accessible. It's very interesting. It's called behavioral therapy. And let's say, it's a branch of psychology. Now, what behavioral therapy does, let's say you have a trauma in your past. What do? You go back in your past and you focus on that very scary place. And what happens, you try to articulate it. You try to explain it. it's easier said than done, because it's a very complex thing to do and require the guidance of an expert. And at the end, what do? You focus not only on one, but many traumas, and slowly you proceed with a hierarchy of, let's say, of complexity, of intensity of the trauma, and hopefully the person becomes strong enough to deal with all their traumas. And so whenever it's called exposure therapy, it's the base of behavioral therapy. So whenever you have to face something you're afraid of, if you face it voluntarily, then your entire mindset and your entire physiology changes. It's like becoming a predator. And you by facing this fear, you become stronger every single time. And what is very the application on traumas are unlimited, let's say, because traumas are nothing that lock up emotion in our past that we are very afraid of. We feel guilty about, maybe a list of possible set of emotions. We focus on the past, we are afraid of it, and we shape it, we give it a shape, and then how to say, we try to extract it. And so this, let's say, is a representation of what trauma might be in a timeline. Usually a patient is not so ordered. It's every time we have something chaotic in our mind, and it is best for us to order our thoughts. But essentially, so we go back in time. Instead of starting with big traumas, we start with this lower one. The patient becomes stronger and stronger every time, tries to articulate it, and then the entire thing begins to make sense, and the patient gets better every single time. So this is essentially what happens in a normal therapy. So you have to understand the trauma. You go by, you describe it, you make a person talk about it, and this doesn't help yet. But then you have to analyze what are called, well, the sensible points. So you go to a specific part and you see that the person start to have emotional reaction of all sorts. Maybe he looks away, maybe start crying, maybe he takes poses. And this is essentially the emotions coming back from that regression point. And you have, that's a very beautiful hint to go through and to understand where the trauma is located. And the way we express our trauma, it's using our words. It's incredibly important to articulate it, because if you are able to articulate the trauma, then it's kind of disappears, because it's a failing framework of interpretation. And then right now you have a bigger framework of interpretation. That's the first slide. And what happens, you use that to understand the previous failures. And then that is essentially how it happens. Now, does it always work? Unfortunately not. It depends on how competent is the psychologist, because there are very good psychologists. There are also the ones that are not so prepared on this. Some that are too judgmental, I don't know, but you need to be very analytical to understand what's wrong. Patient usually does not commit, for what I know, because it's very tough to get them even to write something. And also it depends by the response. Now, this is, let's say, the second part of the presentation. And I wanted to talk about one research that connects, let's say, the study on traumas with the language. Now, this is very interesting. There has been a psychologist, it's called James Penbaker, and he made a very, it was studying, let's say, how traumas affect physical health. And so what happened, he did a very, very easy experiment. He took some people and made them write about something random. I think that was it. And then took some people and made them write about their traumas for 4 consecutive days, 15 minutes a day. And what he discovered, that people who kept traumatic, people who keep the traumatic event secret, they have higher chances of getting sick. So if you have a trauma, it's better to express it, not necessarily to someone else, but just write it down. That was the base of his research. It's not so easy all the time, but that is a significant improvement. That was, I think, a research back in '88. And so if you articulate, you discover that if you articulate the trauma and you don't keep it hidden, then there are significant changes. and that's a mind-boggling research, you could say, because it really started to formalize the conception of trauma healing. And so what he did, he created a software. He attempted to create a software on how to analyze his results. Now, the final product is called LIWC 2015, but there have, since 88 or 90, there have been many software he tried to create. So when he was analyzing the data, he said, okay, so what is the best predictor to see if a trauma is improving or not? What the best way to see if you are improving or not? And he tried many kinds of analysis and all failed. Nobody was able to understand the pattern. Well, what happens is he tried to do a semantic analysis. So instead of focusing on the content that is way more complex, he focused on, okay, let's categorize the words in different dimensions. So he created a list of words like positive emotions, negative emotions, anger words, happy words, etc. There are 80 big categories. And he discovered something incredible. Some words, specifically function words, that is a category that englobes, let's say, pronouns. He wrote a single book about the healing properties of pronouns. I think it's called like this. And those pronouns, those function words, are able to predict if you're going to be better or not. Let's say words like I understand, now I understand that. It's a sentence, but it words that implies that you are transitioning from one place to another, one state to another in terms of traumatic experience. And so, first of all, that is basically what happens. You have a text, you get each word, and you map it with the corresponding category. And you have an entire count, and you can actually check how many positive words, how many function words, etc., etc. That is not AI, of course, but I will get to that. And so what did we do? What did he do specifically? He did something almost incredible. And he essentially found a way to connect something so big like traumatic experience, traumatic healing and psychotherapy to something that is to something that is statistically significant. He found a way to generate data regarding traumas. And when you have to deal with software and artificial intelligence, you have to generate data. You need to know that what is the statistics model you're going to use to process that data into a model that is able to make predictions. And that is essentially what happens. He created this transition, and we can actually work on that. Now, the issue right now, it's okay, so are there any application on traumas? Well, there is this software, but that's not artificial intelligence. So are there any existing applications on trauma? No, not in artificial intelligence, and I will explain why. So you miss an autonomous software, you miss an AI that is able to bring it to the next level. And you need something that is able to not to be patient specific, but is able to apply to different set of patients. And it's not, there are so many impediments to create that, but why not making a try? So in this part, I will try to explain how would I create a model that is able to it's able, let's say, to with its lowest degree of complexity to deal with the trauma of patients. It's going to be reliable. How can it? Because of course I need to be specific. So okay, so what kind of data, first of all, are we talking about? Because also that one, we already know that from text you can extract words in different categories. Well, but is that enough? Well, no, not technically. You have to, it's even better to put more reliable. Every person is different. It's not only from analyzing the words that you might understand how to deal with that person. You have to understand his personality, his social status, because it might be related to trauma. You have to understand also its intelligence. What's a person like? Now, can we do that? Well, actually fairly well, and we can use a model that, my favorite, by the way, is called the Big Five personality model. And it's a statistical model that attempts to predict your personality. And it's a statistical model, so it's very reliable. And after basically you ask the people a bunch of questions, and then you see how they converge together, and you end up with five different dimensions, which one are openness, that predicts creativity; conscientiousness, that predicts how hard you work, essentially; extroversion, how well you do in social interaction and you stay with friends; agreeableness, that predicts empathy. Many people would like that information because you always hear people talking about empathic abilities. Well, that's agreeableness is in the Big Five model. And also it's a neuroticism, how much you are sensible to negative emotions. And with high neuroticism, something little happen in your world collapse. So mm, I believe in this set of dimensions, the last two are what makes people more sensible to traumatic experience. Mostly because with neuroticism, it's the way you interpret the what happens in your world. And agreeableness is also, if you are too empathetic, you're likely going to experience very bad emotions from the cruelty of the outside world. And if you are low in agreeableness, you are very competitive and even say aggressive, then it's fairly easier to deal with those with some environments. So it really depends on your personality, but I think those two traits are the ones that tip the most. So okay, so let me state, okay, how would I use this information to create an artificial intelligence model? And of course, I will also begin explaining what kind what are for example, for clustering. I know there are some people who already know that, but some people may not. So I will also explain what are the artificial intelligence model, how they work very quickly. So first thing I would do, for example, I would make a distinction of all different people. And let's say I would collect all people based on country, personality, intelligence, social status. You may ask why? Well, because in some countries, for example, you may think people are more repressed. Their society do not allow them to express emotion in a certain way. So if you live in one of those countries, very difficult to express yourself. You're gonna keep everything inside. Perhaps other countries instead is the opposite. If I make a comparison, not of countries right now, but in back in time, in medieval times, for example, people were not repressed at all. They could talk about everything. But in the Puritan age, especially the ones where Freud was existing, the Victorian age mostly, people were very repressed. They couldn't talk about even sexual experience. There were many things that people were not allowed to talk and were not allowed to get rid of. And that's a big difference. So you have to find what are the clusters. And also intelligence is not related to trauma, but I think is indirectly related. The personality is related a lot. Your social status, people who interact with. And if you create cluster, then you identify segments of patients from which who might share similar experiences. For example, if you take two people, let's say those two clusters, and people who are very, very smart, and they are likely to perform very well in school. So you might think that school is not one of the places where they have traumatic experience, at least not in grades, maybe. That's an assumption, but maybe it has statistical significance when we get to bigger numbers. So first of all, what is clustering? Is essentially use you have a data set of many different dimensions. Okay, it can be I put the some personality trait here, but you can have a lot of them, and then you start basically isolating the rows. You're grouping the rows, and so you have a group that it says, okay, their numbers, they are close enough so that they can represent one group. So for example, this group may represent all people who are sensible to traumas. Those group are all people who are not sensible to traumas. So they need to have different responses. And of course, this is not simplified. Of course, different dimensions require a more advanced mathematical interpretation. So this is just bidimensional. Of course, it doesn't apply to the gap, but that's an oversimplification, of course. And then, of course, what are also the relevant information we can extract from a patient? Because I have also that one, I have to be technical. Well, you have an input of all the information put in a data set in a particular way. Well, how do you analyze it? So first of all, we create the clusters. Then we ask a patient to go through their traumatic experience. And first of all, it has written text. Written text, it's incredibly important. If you write something regarding your traumas, I understood that, first of all, you externalize. And then you create a monument in the world that only you can understand and shape. One of the most difficult things for psychologists, I think, is to convince patients to try the therapies. In this case, it's to make someone write down about the traumatic experience. Takes very high commitment. So you have written text, and then you have the speech. So if a computer can record you and see you, it sees, first of all, do you have a different tone of voice when you arrive to different part of your speech, of your traumas? So do you have a different tone? Is the content crude, maybe? Is the content unusual, let's say, that, or it changes from the way that you talk usually, so use a different vocabulary. So there are all hints that you can see, including the emotion or facial expression. When we talk about trauma, as I said, we look away, we cry, but we have our muscle tense. We usually, I think this set of muscles here, it clamps a lot when you have to talk about very traumatic stuff. You can see it very easily. So you make the patient list the traumas, and usually use a timeline, and it's very difficult for somebody to list also the traumas. And you start, let's say, with the basics. Then you use the software already available on the market. What they do, they can predict how well you're going to do in the trauma, but how big is the trauma? What is its impact? And what do? You estimate the impact of every trauma. So you see, okay, maybe this trauma was big, but you processed it. Maybe this trauma was, it was very little, etc., etc. But right now, this is the biggest trauma you don't want to talk about. So you create a hierarchy of traumatic experience from the least to the most intense, and you see which one to target before. So you start, first of all, you see, okay, you start from the little one. Okay, this is a traumatic experience you can deal with. And so the software, let's say, iterates through each one of them and see where to start. And at the beginning, okay, so he asks you to express the trauma. And then now that's the important part. Well, how does he know what to ask? Because it's the software that has to guide the patients in dealing with the trauma. And even for a psychologist, it's difficult. Let's imagine for software. And so you keep track of what might be the sensible points. And it's where you have the sensible points that you want to extract more information, because in that metaphysical place in your head lies the source of your trauma. It's like you got hit by a car. When you say that, your heart stops, so it starts to beat. You cannot process it well. Then you need to explain that. And so what the software does, it may identify what are the sensible points by all this kind of information, and then okay, we can generate a question that basically explores this area and says, okay, well, tell me more about that. It's not only tell me more about that. What happened in this setting? How do you feel about it? These are general questions, but it's better to get specific. What does that remind you of, etc., etc. And I don't think, also the point of creating all those clusters is like, why the hell are you going to create clusters if you have one single approach? Well, my assumption is if you have many clusters and who may share equal experiences, well, then you also have data regarding those possible, mm, how to say, regarding those sensible parts. So if you got two patients who have similar experiences, their traumatic experience might be shared. You know exactly, after you treat the first patient, you receive the feedback. Well, the AI can learn from that, so it sees what are the sensible part of the first one, and it tries to estimate what are the sensible part of the second one. So it's basically, with the previous data, you train the AI to recognize the sensible parts and to generate the questions. Would think about GPT-3, that is the latest text generator from OpenAI, for example. So you allow the AI to slowly guide you toward this process. And this is essentially how it's interesting. I cannot get much in detail because it will take too much time. That's essentially how language is represented in a dense vector. So how does the AI understand the concept of context in terms of speech? So you put all the words in the language it's called dense vector, in this mathematical field, in this mathematical space that has now is represented as 3D, but it has multiple dimensions. And then you see how each one of them is close to another. And you see that, for example, I choose the word stressed. Then you see that all those words are close to the word stress. They are in the same context, and within that, you can, let's say, the AI is able to predict what is going to say, and so create a sentence that is coherent within the context. So if you have a traumatic experience, the AI cannot ask about pizza, which some AI do. And latest, this is how I usually understand the entire thing. That this is not a formal. You can throw it away if you don't like it. This is not a formal sketch, let's say, but this is what happens. What I think is, but with traumatic experience, you have many clumped together. But what happens is the brain always understand how the things what are the factors that are common all across the traumas. So let's say that there are many those are caused by another factor, etc., etc. The brain is able to recognize that. This is my understanding. And if you are able to create clumps and to see what are the common factors among the traumas, then you might be able to guide the person through healing even better, or in the correct way, let's say. Because so you see there are 20 traumas, but all the 20 traumas, they have something in common. So let's say school, or perhaps your parents, and you realize that the problem are not healing those 20 traumas, but healing what is common across all the traumas. What's the problem that a person has with school? What is the problem that a person has with parents? And if you are able to extract that information and to allow the patient to articulate that as well, then you might proceed into a more complete, let's say, level of healing. Now, fairly the presentation, I wanted to keep it under 40 minutes, so I had to speed up. But okay, so is this really achievable? Well, in theory, yes, because it's not even so difficult. All the data I'm talking about, first of all, are numerical, are not categorical. And we start from that to create the clusters. And from the clusters, then we are able to guide the AI into find the sensible parts into the speech of every trauma. But the most of the problem is the biggest problem most is data collection. So when data, for example, if you treat trauma, you need to collect data from many different people, and that is a very sensible data. You cannot, and when data leaves your computer, well, that's a big problem, independently of whatever you say you're going to use it for. So whenever, let's say that I want to create a giant software that collects this kind of data, that's going to be, I'm not going to, but it's going to be a very big problem, because why should you give me your data voluntarily, even if I promise not to use it? there are many regulations that change from country to country. So practically, it's just difficult to get the data before analyzing it. And then, of course, the biggest problem is what if the AI makes a mistake? So what if a person that suffers from very big traumatic experience and you make the AI is able to make the problem worse, and this person it's even has bigger trouble. So there is it's to create this model, you can only attempt to create it in a low resolution way. Because of course, what I've been trying to describe is of course reductive. But if you increase in complexity, then it's so elaborate yet. And you need to find a way to align it with the current technologies. Because many people, I think, they think as traumas in a very ordinary way. So trauma there, and there is a timeline where you can identify the traumas, but that's not the issue. Most of the time, sorry for the rudimental drawings, but most of the time it's intersected with our life. So if people suffer of depression, let's say, they also have traumatic experience that they crash on top of it. So you cannot just separate the two parts and say, okay, let's separate the traumatic experience, depression. And the AI is very specific because the AI is essentially is a set of tools to solve problems. So it's not like one. You have many different AIs, and then you can pick the right AI for your problem. So you have to be very specific in which kind of problem you want to solve. And so if you create a software specifically for this one, what happens when you have a patient that has all this clumped together? You cannot create a software for depression. Well, I think so. You really need an expert on that because it's much different, it's much more complex than trauma. So, and if you intersecate the entire thing, it's some people we only have these two separated, but other everything is clustered together and you cannot really separate it. So it really depends by case to case. So I think I am done with my presentation. Perfect. So should I stop screen sharing? One second. Let me wait for Miss Itek. And let me open YouTube so and see if there are any questions.
Hello. Actually, I was also having some internet problems, so my internet kind of got stuck. So sorry for that.
It's okay, no problem.
Thanks a lot for your great talk. First of all, I really enjoyed it because this topic is really it's one of my personal interests. So I really like studying about psychology and everything. So it was really interesting.
So actually, there is a question. Let me read it out.
Mm-hmm.
So Vasundra, thank you very much for the question. So as the system becomes more and more aware of different personalities and it learns, is it possible? But do not detangling their thoughts and their traumatic experience in such a situation, is it possible to make the person problem worse as the system was essentially rushed through the process? Well, first of all, let me answer each question individually. Well, yeah, of course, all systems, especially in artificial intelligence, have the risk of becoming biased. But there are also ways to correct it. Now, even if it's a low resolution spectrum, what you're proposing me, it's you can set limitation on how the AI is going to approach. So it's like 90% of the patients get healed let's say, well, the AI may still remain under a threshold and analyze, let's say, and keep analyzing at a certain level the other patients. With the, in this case, of course, it would be better for the second question. Um, yes, I think yes, the AI would have a high chance to make the problem worse. But the particularity of, let's say, of the speech is not how to create a perfect software. Is what is the first approach for an artificial intelligence to to approach traumatic experience, even if it's lower resolution. So the entire point of also the research of Penn-Baker, it's bypassing the need of comprehending the personal experience. That is one mind-boggling. Of course, there are many people who do not, let's say, do not agree with that. And of course, it's always better to have someone who understands the experience. But think about that. If you are able to bypass that and also find predictors within the things you write, rather than what you write, sorry, the how you write rather than what you write and the things you write, that, and it's statistically significant, well, that can apply to a very high, within a group, let's say 100,000 people, that could apply to 90,000. So the real applications are statistically significant for that case. Of course, there will be a minority that will have trouble. That was also, I was underlining that at the end of the presentation. Oh, and I thank you for highlighting the comment. So may I ask if anybody has other questions, or maybe Miss Itek?
I have a question to ask
Oh,
you.
please.
Yeah. So right now, the system you've made is just basically, so it focuses on traumas, right? So for example, how would you have controls that measure the validity and the reliability of what you have done? So for example, a lot of, like, how can you account for all the traumas out there, because people have many different kinds of
Well,
problems,
I can use the LIWC software. So that software has been specifically created to assess the traumas and to see what are the predictors that do well. And if it gets, I don't know if because I never try, it's not so easy to get your hands on the software, even if it's open source. But it analyzes a trauma, and it basically sets up all these numbers, and it tells you if you're doing well with the trauma or not, and if the current predictors are essentially saying, well, is the trauma going to improve or not? So I would use this software to estimate how people are performing on each of the traumas, and then I'll have to see if it's better to have an average or just, let's say, underlining what is the progress on the biggest traumas, let's say the top three, and then you keep going that direction and see if things get better.
All right. So do you have like any ending comments or anything else to add?
Actually, well, no, not really. It was very enjoyable experience. Thank you so much for hosting me. I thought I did not
Thanks
bore
a
you too
lot.
much.
No, of course not. I actually really liked your speech. So thanks a lot for joining us, and I hope you can be here with us once again. And also, like, my apologies for my internet trouble, so I had to make you wait.
It's all right.
Yeah, so thanks a lot.
Perfect. So thank you everybody for listening. It was very enjoyable, and see you everybody.
See you. Bye bye. Hope you have a
Bye
great
bye.
weekend. Bye
Thank
bye.
you.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. Please stay tuned next week for another webinar. So till then, everyone have a great weekend. Bye bye.